Okay. Let's see. Our next question is on extended fasting and muscle loss from Keith. He says, Rob, how are you coming on your piece regarding fasting, mTOR, and aging strategies? I ask because I'm at a point in my health journey where I've lost the ugly weight, refocused on gaining muscle mass, and would now like to shed a little bit more fat to reveal the fruits of my labor. To do so, I've been planning on getting back to a strict ketogenic lifestyle, including a moderately aggressive fasting regimen. This is the same strategy I implemented during my initial 70-pound, 8-month weight loss that was largely inspired by the work of Jason Fung. I know you don't necessarily agree with Dr. Fung's opinions on fasting being a largely muscle-sparing venture, which is why I've been lurking in anticipation of your work on this topic. In my journey from 230 pounds to 160 pounds, I took part in daily intermittent fasts, frequent 36-hour fasts, and several fasts of 70 to 100 hours in duration. Based on this experience, I didn't encounter any noticeable effect on my strength or visible musculature, even as I got down to a modest body fat percentage in the mid-teens. With that being said, I'm very interested in the specifics of your views on extended fasting as a potential tool for cutting fat while preserving muscle, specifically as it would relate to hypertrophy-focused resistance training goals. A discussion between you and Dr. Fung on this topic would make for one incredibly interesting podcast. Thanks for your time and for all of your continued work. Your ability to interpret and convey complex topics is unsurpassed in this field.
Oh, thank you. That's very kind. So I've noodled for like 5 years. I've had a file on like a longevity book, and because I was foolish enough to write both the Keto Masterclass book and the sustainability book with Diana Rogers at the same time, I kind of freaked out and put most of the longevity stuff that I think matters in the Keto Masterclass book. There's still some other stuff that wasn't really germane to that topic, but I ended up talking a lot about mTOR and these pluses and minuses. And in the previous question, I kind of alluded to some of the stuff. Keith, I think a key thing to take away from this, and I'm inferring this from the way that you worded this stuff, but it sounds like you were doing resistance training during your fasted state, and that was a common feature throughout this whole story. And I would make the case that to the degree you maintained both muscle mass and strength during fasting, it had nothing to do with fasting and everything to do with the fact that you were strength training. There's some great studies that suggest that strength training, particularly daily strength training, full body, doesn't have to be a ton of work, but a decent amount of resistance will really forestall the lion's share of the tendency to lose muscle mass. Dr. Fung's a great dude. He's very smart. He's made some great contributions to the scene, but I think he's also been kind of fast and loose with it and hasn't really dug into some of the details in the literature. I think fasting is a great tool. It can be a fantastic modality. But again, if one is looking at that as ultimately a body composition endpoint as the goal, then the strength training, the resistance training has to be a key feature to that. So what we're introducing in that scenario then is very significant calorie restriction, enough of a pulse of anabolic stimulus from strength training that we're not totally losing, hopefully, a ton of muscle mass. And the fact that strength levels were largely maintained, as evidenced by your statement there, then that's probably a pretty good thing. Some of my challenge with fasting as kind of the primary modality for people to lose weight, and doesn't sound like this applies to you, but fasting is the absence of eating, and at some point that must stop, and then you need to eat again. And if we haven't created sound habits, whether it's high carb, whether it's low carb, whether it's vegan, whatever the hell it is, if we haven't established some sound principles there, then people tend to default to their old habits. Yeah, and they tend to go back to overeating. And again, I'm not saying that that's the case with you, but this has been my observation around fasting. The recent low carb Denver, I've had nervousness also around fasting to some degree, and this is tough. On the one hand, we as a society are definitely overfed, and we eat too much and we eat too frequently. So we should experience some degree of fasting that would help balance that stuff, like turning mTOR on, turning mTOR off, all that type of stuff. The flip side of this, though, and there was a doctor, an oncologist, and I'm blanking on her name now, but I've had some nervousness around really aggressive fasting, because part of the goal within this story is autophagy, cellular turnover, stimulating apoptosis in abnormal cells. But the thing is that what constitutes abnormal, it's a range, it's not a binary point. And so she made the case that overly aggressive fasting will burn through the stem cell pool and that you will end up dying early. And this has been established in animals, where they intermittent fast these animals and they end up with organ failure because of the Hayflick limit. It's a term that describes the notion that in general mammalian cells can replicate about 50 times. Each time they replicate, they lose a little bit of the telomeres, and once the telomeres are gone, the cells don't really replicate anymore. They become senescent and they're done. And if you burn through all your stem cell pool, you don't have anything left to replace that. So the balance in my mind that we're trying to strike in this case, if we're looking at a longevity play, is you want cells to actually hang out as long as they can, so long as they're healthy. Then once they get into that unhealthy state, which again is a spectrum, not a binary point, then we kick them over the edge with some sort of autophagic process. Lifting weights, coffee, some degree of intermittent fasting or time-restricted feeding. Peter Attia makes the case that human metabolism is much slower than animal metabolism, so we may need some longer periods of fasting to be able to get the same type of benefits that animals do. So maybe autophagy and exercise don't quite work exactly the same in humans. I think we still need to figure some of that stuff out, but we do know that exercise and just simply not overeating is a net win. Like, people tend to live really well and fairly long lives in that story. So, you know, whether or not you should do a fasting regimen, again, I think that some sort of a time-restricted feeding, like, you know, eat breakfast at 8 or 9 and wrap up dinner at 4 or 5, like that seems totally reasonable. Maybe once a month you do a workout on a Saturday morning and you fast until Monday morning, and in between those couple of days you do a couple of other strength training sessions to maintain muscle mass. But I still just kind of default to, like, find a good eating regimen that you can more or less run the rest of your life with. Like, focus on that as a baseline, because people are reasonably successful at losing weight. They're just more successful at regaining weight. And the real challenge there is finding something that is sustainable over a lifetime. And I just don't know if the ping-ponging back and forth between weight gain and fasting is really doing folks any type of benefits. Maybe it's better than just gaining weight, you know, spiraling out of control. But this is one thing that Lane Norton made a case on the Joe Rogan podcast, which was that when people lose weight and regain weight, when they go to lose weight the next time, it is significantly harder. Like, we had a question around metabolic set point in the last podcast, and it appears that metabolic set point kind of ingrains harder because the body is kind of like, fuck that, we're not, you know, scarcity is kind of the thing that we're the most concerned about. And so it's almost like it digs the metabolic heels in to make the process harder to lose weight subsequently. So the point there is that I would just focus on what is going to be long-term sustainable. And I've just seen so much success with some sort of a ketogenes type approach. Lift weights 3 to 4 days a week, be generally active, introduce a mild caloric deficit. If somebody really wants to goose fat loss and maintain body composition, I think a protein sparing modified fast, PSMF, is incredibly powerful. It's working via different mechanisms than a straight up fast with regards to protein intake, but I would argue that it's better for a body recomposition perspective. So, man, I don't know that I've got a really specific, concrete answer out of this, other than I would encourage you to just noodle on what is the thing that you can do that is going to be long-term sustainable, like over decades, and use some iteration of that as your home base, your core, and then kind of iterate from there.